All right. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I welcome you to this fireside chat at the Global Policy, Diplomacy and Sustainability Fellowship. I have the great pleasure of hosting Her Excellency Ameenah Gurib-Fakim. I would request everybody else who's not speaking to please keep their phones on mute. Aditi, if you could help us mute some of the others whom we can hear over here. Thank you. So it's an absolute pleasure hosting Her Excellency Ameenah Gurib-Fakim, who's the first female president of the Republic of Mauritius, who served from 2015 to 2018. She began her career as a lecturer at the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Mauritius. She served as the Dean of Faculty of Science and Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Mauritius from 2004 to 2010. She received a PhD in Organic Chemistry from the University of Exeter, UK, and is a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry. In 1989, she was awarded the CChem Award by the Royal Society of Chemistry in recognition of her skills and contribution to the field of chemistry. She has written and co-edited 26 books, numerous articles in the field of biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable development. She also served as the managing director of the Center for Phototherapy and Research and the professor of organic chemistry at the University of Mauritius. Your Excellency, a big welcome to you. Thank you so much for sparing the time for speaking with us.
Thank you so much, Arpit, and thank you for associating with this very important discussion. And you're touching a theme which resonates with us, small islands, of course, many other issues as well. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. So let's jump right into our conversation. So we are talking about small islands and the voices of nations like Mauritius. So voices of small nations. My question to you is that, do you think that large developing as well as developed countries are doing enough to safeguard the interest of small island nations in the face of extreme climate change and rising sea levels? Because recently we've just had COP26, and a lot of the future of climate change and sea levels depends on the actions taken by the Indias, the Chinas, the United States, the Russias. And I want to understand from you firsthand whether you have confidence in the actions of some of these large nations.
That's a very leading question. If we go by what's happened over the past 2 years, I think we saw what the word interest mean. And we saw how the interest of some countries, of some regions, mattered more over what was happening to the rest of humanity. So I'm not going to say I'm a pessimist, but I'm a realist. And we, as a small island state, we constitute a consortium of about over 30 countries across the world. And we are really at the forefront of climate change. And the same goes for the rest of the African continent, where they're bigger countries. And if you look at our emission combined, we don't exceed 5%. Even that, I'm really being generous. So if we look at the emission coming out from these countries, we can say that we are the victims of the changing climate, and we are going to be bearing the brunt of the impact of climate change. Of course, if you look at small island state, the first thing that's going to happen, of course, with the sea level rise will be such that the countries will disappear. I mean, if you look at a country like Maldives, they're only about 4 or 5 meters above sea level. So any increase in the height in the water level will mean disappearance of quite a few of the beautiful beaches in that particular country. There are countries which have already taken measures. And if you look at a country like Tuvalu, I know they have been discussing with Fiji to see how the population can be relocated. So that's one of the downside of climate change. And if you look what happened at COP, I think I have to mention again the speech that was given by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley. And she has been very, very explicit. And she says, the pledges that have been made when there was the first agreement at the COP in Paris in 2015, the pledges have never been delivered on. And in fact, she used something which was quite amusing. She says, mind the gap. There is always a gap in the investment in the green fund. And the gap as we speak is, I think, is about over $25 billion. One thing we have to put here on the table is that when we look at the green fund, I think, first of all, I have to point out that this is not a charity which is being given to small island and developing countries. It is not a charity. I will explain quickly why. You know, when this was discussed, why was the green fund created in the first place? Because the lungs of the world, they are in the global south. The forests, which actually ensure our oxygen intake every day, mostly come from the global south. If you look at the diversity of the flora and the fauna of the south, they are all in developing countries. Now, so one thing that when we say that we need the green fund, we need access technology, we need to be able to transition to greener ways of doing business. We need to cut down emission. And this is something that nobody wants to agree on, because the science is very clear. It is the emission which is now driving the change in the climate. And one thing, because we're talking about climate change, we're talking about small island state, wherever we talk about the power difference, the power gap, we always say, oh, it's the rich countries driving the agenda with the funds and all the rest of it. But there are intangibles which we cannot put a price on. And in fact, if you go back to the works of Professor Sir Das Gupta in Cambridge University, he has tried to put a value on ecosystem services, which nature gives us for free. And if you look at his seminal work on this item, he actually tries to capitalize the value of the ecosystemic services which nature gives us for free. And he puts it at over 125 trillion US dollars per year given to us free. Now, where are these services coming from? They are coming from the global south. They are coming from island states. And when you look at island states, we occupy less than 2% of the world's surface. And yet, we provide, when you say we, I mean all the biodiversity hotspots, which actually, which we actually sit on, they contribute over 40% of the ecosystemic services for the most vulnerable people on this planet. And when we talk about ecosystemic services, we are also talking about the livelihoods of those people living in the north. And I think one thing that COVID has shown us is the interconnectedness with all of us, with nature, with our environment. And if the theory of the bat remains true, I mean, I say if, because we still don't know, but I say if, because that was the argument that was put forward before. I mean, this brings us to a very, very fundamental problem, is that the closer we get to nature, the more we destroy our forests, the more we are cutting the branch on which we are all sitting. And this is something that we have to understand. I say we, I mean really collective, we North and South. We need to put our head together and realize that the green dollar is all good, but it's not enough to save us from ourselves.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that powerful opening statement, Your Excellency. My follow-up question to that, in fact, two of them, is that one, do you think that the global North-South argument is diluting the debate in terms of the nations who are most affected? Like a lot of times the discussion is between the global North and the global South, but then it doesn't give enough voice to states like Barbados, states like Mauritius, while the global South debate is usurped by other larger countries. So that's question number one. And question number two is, what is the contingency plan? Like if at all, the worst happens, that some of these countries, you talked about Maldives, they start getting submerged, then how does the relocation process look like? Like, what does it like? Do they have pacts with other countries that, okay, this is the area, this is the country that our population would relocate to? And how serious are these plans, and how foolproof are these plans so that they cause minimal losses of life?
Pete, let's go back to the basics, right? What has been our development model so far?
Mhm.
How did we reach to where we are today in terms of emission, which has been produced over a century ago when the West started with the Industrial Revolution? Right,
Yeah.
this is where it all started, and it's been incremental. It's been adding every year, so it's not something that we discovered recently. So our entire business model, as pushed by the North, and this is not something that I am saying because this has been said all the time by the great thinkers like Keynes and all these great thinkers, they have said that our business model has for too long depended on extraction. We have always extracted. And in fact, if you look at the way we have even talk about GDP, it is all based on extraction, it's based on destruction. We haven't changed that model. It is still there and will always be there because every time we talk about progress, we always say that, what is a GDP growth? So this is the way we have been doing it. And who has driven the agenda so far? Of course, is those countries that have been there, the past colonial powers, and those countries, which have shaped the international agenda through setting up of the multilateral institutions, the Bretton Woods Organization, all that, it's all been there. So the drive has always been the economy, the drive has always been there. The model for development has always been extraction. So when we have now emerging countries, they say, why should we not pollute? Because that has been the way that economies have grown. So this is the way things are, and I think this is where the deadlock is going to be. How are we going to transition so that it does not impact growth? If you look at the way that the text has been watered down at COP26, the big players, I'm not going to mention any country for obvious reason, but they can recognize themselves, is that they have watered down the text to actually say that, literally say that fossil fuel should not be blamed for driving the greenhouse gas emission. And we all know, all the science has been there to show that. But the problem is okay, we should not be apportioning blame, but where is the leadership? Where is a strong multilateral system that needs to be put in place so that we can get our heads around this problem? And this is where we're lacking. This is where we're missing. We are not seeing that leadership. And the model that had been developed since World War II has been a bipolar world, then became a unipolar world. And now we're saying we are going to a multipolar world. So where are we going to get that leadership? I think we have to go back to the United Nations. We have to go back to the reforms of the United Nations to see to it that there is representation. I just look, in fact, last week I had this discussion even in Ras Al Khaimah when I was discussing. Let's look at the power play at the level of the UN. Who actually calls the shot? The UN Security Council. What is the membership like? I said this last week and I will say it again. One continent representing 500 million people, over 7 billion, actually takes 40% of membership. Where is Africa? 1.4 billion. Where is the ASEAN group? Right? Where's the Mercosur? Where's the South American countries? Why are they not represented? So there has to be some reform. And one thing I have said as well, and I will say it again, is that this veto power that these groups have had, which they represented in 1945, of course,
right.
they after 1945, this group is completely redundant because the countries that came after 1945, 1948, they are not represented anywhere. So where is the leadership? That's what we need to ask. And in fact, if we had stopped bickering last year, if we had taken the COVID seriously and taken it up to the Security Council, immediately, just like we did with Ebola in 2014, we would not be seeing this crisis as we see it today. What we saw last year was apportioning blame and backstabbing people and trying to throw the blame. But instead, we should have had a very strong leadership. Joint, so many emerging countries, so many powerful countries now, joint leadership and try and tackle this upfront. And we would not be, as we speak today, where it is. So the same thing, if we adopt the same playbook as we have done for COVID, the situation is going to be dire in the face of climate change.
No, absolutely. And I think this sort of a mutual bickering is at the root of this lack of cooperation, is at the root of a lot of problems that we're seeing in the world. But I see that John has a follow-up question to this. So let me invite John. Go ahead, please.
Oh, well, thank you, Your Excellency. So I kind of want to pivot the conversation a little bit about what you said earlier. I'm just bringing in a little bit of the private sector lens here. So earlier on, you mentioned that, in your introduction, you mentioned that there are greener ways to do business, and people oftentimes try to categorize the value that nature provides us for free, and so on and so forth. But can you talk a little bit about how small island nations can enable the private sector and encourage investments into a new greener economy and sustainable technologies?
Well, I think we, as a small group, as I said, we are very, very small at the level of the international forum. We are, I mean, come on, we have 1 million people here in Mauritius. If you look at a country like Barbados, it's just under 300,000. So we are a very, very small group. But I think what we can do, as I said, is try and restore the ecosystems. And by restoring the ecosystem, we are creating a greener and a safer planet. So for this to be able to transition to this greener ecosystem, we need access to the tools. And this is where a North-South dialogue, a North-South collaboration matters. And I consider my country to be an ocean state because we have a land space of 2.2 square kilometer, thousand square kilometer, but we have an ocean space of 2.2 million square kilometer. And if we look at what Seychelles did, and here I will posit that as a way of sharing good practices. Seychelles has negotiated with some multilateral organizations as well of how they can preserve the ecosystem for debt swap. So these are things that we can do because by preserving the outside the sea mass, which is outside jurisdiction, if we can help in that space, we are going to be using. I don't like this word, but I will use it because people understand it better. We can provide these fantastic ocean sinks for absorbing more of this greenhouse gas emission. And of course, a healthier environment, a healthier ocean ensures cleaner water, ensure that the ecosystem is restored. And when we say ecosystem is restored, means that the whales, for example, will be swimming freely. And of course, we know that the whale by themselves, they are the biggest absorbers of carbon. Mm-hmm. The planktons that they eat, all this ecosystem. So what I'm trying to push for is a system where there is much better cooperation, north and south, big and small, but at the same time recognize the interconnectedness that we all have with each other on this planet. And this is the narrative we have to push for, is that ecosystem matter. This is the branch, as I said earlier, on which we are all sitting. And we have to get the private sector to be partner to the system. Having said this, I will again put another caveat here. Private sector wants to push for greener technologies. Greener technologies will depend on resources, minerals. Yeah. These minerals, again, come from developing countries. If you look at the mobile industry, they have been driven by cobalt from DRC. If we are going to look at the transition to green energies, we are going to look at the rare elements. So again here, question of give and take. We want the corporates that are exploiting the resources in the South to pay your taxes because we need the taxes to actually drive our own economies. And it's only when we do that that we'll see less migration, less refugee leaving the continent to go elsewhere. So I think what we call for is that 100 years ago, the economy has been handed over to the private sector. And look where we are today. So we had a system, but we need a different system. We need to change this mindset, right? In fact, this morning I was listening to a documentary, and I will mention the name of the country because it really felt terrible. If you look at a country like Equatorial Guinea, the country depends on petrol. The petrol is being exploited by ExxonMobil, right? And how much do you think they'll get there in terms of revenue? They get a paltry 10 to 12%. Yeah. I mean, come on, this is not serious. And then we say, oh, the country is corrupt. But for every corrupter, there's a corruptee. So let us come back to the table and look at ways of sharing, because when there is no planet, there is no planet. It's bad. And I will tell you one thing again. I'm sorry, I'm not a diplomat. I will say what I think is that the reason why we are seeing more attention drawn to climate change, I'm sorry to say this, is because countries in the north are now experiencing climate change. We are seeing forests in Seattle. We are seeing temperatures, Kuwait temperature in Seattle. We are seeing forests in Australia. We are seeing forests in Greece. Now people are talking. Now just look at the floods that happen in India when the Ganges overflows.
Yeah.
Countries like Bangladesh every year gets flooded. Nobody thinks about it. Nobody talks about it. But now when you're seeing New York City flooded, and the projections are dire for cities like New York, where it is predicted that many of the buildings are going to be underwater very soon. So now we're seeing traction for climate change because it is impacting cities in the north. So let us be honest with ourselves. There is only one planet, there is no planet B. So the sooner we come to the table and we start sharing, the better it's going to be for all of us. And let us not benchmark ourselves with the COVID when relaxing the rules at the WTO becomes such an issue that now we're having so many multiple variants because there has been 6% in vaccination in Africa. So let us not use that playbook because it's not going to serve us all at all.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Let me bring the discussion back to what you were referring to in terms of reforms at the United Nations. So my question is that how do we instill equitable representation in international relations? Because as you rightly said, that 40% of the United Nations or Security Council decisions are taken by just one continent. And the question over there is that they would certainly not have any incentives to give way to other countries. Now, what is a potential solution, like a parallel UN, or how do you do that?
No, I think the UN has been, I mean, there has been a lot of critique vis-a-vis organization. Even the WHO has had a lot of flack recently.
Yeah.
But if you look at the way the system has been designed, I mean, you know, they operate within a remit. And I think what we have to do is rethink the United Nations. Is still there for a purpose. We need to retool it. But I think, again, I'm sorry, Jonathan, I have to harp on your country again, is that let us have a rule-based organization where people adhere to the rule. If a treaty, a convention has been approved at the level of the United Nations, over 194 countries have approved it, why should one or two countries not sign or not ratify? I mean, during the last administration, we saw how the Trump administration moved out of WHO. Yeah. Right in the midst of a crisis. I mean, we can again apportion blame, we can do all sorts of investigation, but after we have gone through this, we saw withdrawal from that. And you know, this is something that we have to really think. Now, just one thing, I'll be very blunt here. We are the new bogeyman of the West now is China, right? Then this is the new bogeyman. Let's be honest about it. I'm not gonna, I don't sugarcoat anything. Now, let's look at one item. Let's look at the conventions which have been signed and ratified by the United States and by China. Let's look at one item, UNCLOS. Has the US signed it? Has the US ratified it? Has China signed it? Has China ratified it? Ask the question, you can go and check. Now, let's look at the Convention for Biodiversity. Has the US signed it? Has the US ratified it? Has China signed it? Has China ratified it, right? Let's look at this, make a checklist, and you will see who is not playing by the rule. Now, if you want to have a reinvigorated United Nations, we need to have rule-based organization. And the same thing goes for WTO. You need judges. You need to have a level playing field. And if you look at Europe even, look at the subsidies which are given to agriculture. Now, how can an African country cope and actually export when you have big countries which are subsidizing their products? I mean, this is not possible. I mean, there has to be somewhere where the system must change, and change must happen. And change, I think, will happen because the projections are already there. I think we know that by 2050 or 2040, which are the biggest economies that are going to be there. And at some point, things will happen by sheer market size, by sheer market force, because at the end of the day, that's all the language we know.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I also think that we should probably, also look at the real actions on the ground by various nation states and not just, what conventions are they signing on to. But my next question over there, Your Excellency, is that No, the race to net zero is being talked about quite a lot lately, and my my concern over there is that are there too many ambiguities in defining what is net zero? Because as per their own convenience, various players are defining net zero, in their own terms. So, is it eventually just going to be another greenwashing agenda? Or do you think that there's something real to this so-called race to net zero?
Well, the race to net zero has already been put by some countries to 2050 and some to 2060, right? But do you think nature is going to adhere to our agenda, to our deadlines? No way. I mean, I think the scientists are already saying we have reached tipping point. And tipping point is there. When we look at the glaciers which are melting, and you see that, of course, the impact, of course, will be India, all the way in the two major rivers, the Indus, and everywhere. The Mekong is going to overflow, the Yangtze, you name it, all the big rivers are going to be too expensive, especially with their glaciers. So what we'll have to just accept is that we need to move fast. We need to go beyond this rhetoric. I'm sorry, I'm going to say this rhetoric, the greenwashing that the net zero thing is all about. And also we need to ensure that the poorer countries get the right dues, right? And I've just given one example of people paying the taxes, right? People paying all the concession fees that they're exploiting. And also, we still haven't unlearned the lesson of past pandemic. And if we haven't learned the lesson from past pandemic, even this one, I don't think we are learning anything at all, because we're still seeing the same selfishness, the same egotistical way of doing things. We still are not taking our cue. So let us start thinking differently. And I think this is where there will be coalition of countries. We have seen how the ASEAN has been very successful. And I think they will have some way to leverage in the discussion. So it's going to happen regionally. It's going to happen regionally, and I think they will push the agenda for what it matters, because Africa has already signed up to the Africa Free Trade Agreement. It's already operational, and Africa is understanding the lesson in a hard way, because I think they understood the lesson recently when they saw how they were still dependent on outside sources for their basics. And I have been saying this all along. We need to start investing. Africa has had a 60+ year post-independence history. Yep. Okay, I'm not going to be an apologist for this, but it is clear that we have to start running, and we have to start running in terms of investment in our institution, in the human capital. And Africa by 2050 is going to be the youngest continent providing human capital, human resource to the rest of the world. So it is in our interest to start investing in our institution, investing in our production capabilities, investing in transformation of our resources, so that we can then be looked upon as a credible and serious partner.
No, absolutely. And I 100% agree with you when you say that the solutions will have to be found regionally. And that's the reason why my personal research and the research at Global Policy Insights, a think tank, is focused on regional cooperation quite a bit. My last question to you before I open it up to the audience is there any argument for being hopeful amidst the whole climate crisis? Is there any reason for hope?
The human race is an amazing race. I mean, okay, I'll just again caveat what I'm saying. If we were to compress the entire the geological cycle of the world in 24 hours, we would have appeared just a few seconds before midnight. But look at the damage we've done to the planet. Look at the damage that we have done. Having said this, the human race can bounce back. We have shown amazing resilience. We have been through many such problems in the past. Now I think we are much more empowered. We have the tools that we need to help us pull ourselves together so that we can leave a legacy for our kids. I mean, this is what's all about at the end of the day, is to leave a legacy for our children and the grandchildren, and make sure that when our grandchildren actually are born, they will be able to see a glacier for what it's worth, for what we know we have seen ourselves today. So I am an eternal optimist, maybe a prudent one, but we need to change the way our mindset. We need to stop that race, that rat race we have gone into. And because when you are in rat race, you'll end up, of course, down the chute, and it's not going to help us at all. So we need to actually educate our kids that the only way forward is when we start sharing and when we start really helping our fellow global citizens, because this is what we are at the end of the day. And one thing I will say here, because the issue is about refugee, the issue is about migration.
Right.
One thing I would say is that because again, the narrative that the media portrays is that they're all going to the West. It's completely false. It's completely false, because 75% of migrants, they are still living in the developing world. And this is not something that we talk about. So this is what we have to say, but migration has been, I'm a product of migration when my forebears left India 4 generations ago. So we are all products of migration. So let us come to terms with this, that migration brings diversity, migrations bring cultures and enriches our social fabric. So let us accept that. And I think nativistic, atavistic xenophobia, I think it's not the order of the day. So let us rethink our purpose on this planet.
Absolutely. And with those hopeful words, we will open it out to the audience. So one of our GPod's alums, Nikunj, has a question. So I'll let Nikunj unmute himself and go ahead and ask his question to Her Excellency. Okay, Nikunj, if you're not able to unmute yourself, then I'm gonna invite somebody else. I'm gonna invite Saeed or Ashutosh.
I am sorry, but I just...
Okay, Nikunj, you're here. Perfect.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Arpit, and Her Excellency. Thank you so much for joining us today. I had 2 very quick questions for you. You touched base upon how private organizations should actually get involved in taking care of these small nations and kind of investing in these nations, because they're so-called going green in the future, which I really don't see happening, having said that I stay in the United States now. So what do you think is one of the incentives for them to kind of invest in these countries and come in and play an important role in trying to conserve the environment and just the future for our generations and all of the other reasons you mentioned? And my second question will be, you spoke about how we are at the tipping point today and how we're going to go down the hill in the near future when we're waiting for major countries to kind of sign and ratify policies. What do you think is something we do today in our power to kind of help start and bring this change, instead of actually waiting for them until 2040 or 2050 for them to learn from their mistakes and kind of realize, like you said, how Africa learned from their mistakes and learned it the hard way, and now we realize what we are doing and we need to move progressively. So what are your thoughts on this area?
Could you respond to your first question? How, for example, I'll take it from my own country, a small island state, and our resources come from tourism, because almost 30% of our GDP come from tourism. And I think this is where, again, a North-South dialogue can help, for example, boost our tourism sector, but more importantly, help rejuvenate that tourism sector and make it greener and make it sustainable. And here, if I draw a parallel with what's happened in Costa Rica, for example, Costa Rica has got an amazing tourism sector, and they have a tourism sector which is green, which is sustainable. And they have, with the collaboration of many organizations, they have been able to use that economy, that tourist sector, to actually help protect their own biodiversity. So these are some of the initiatives that we can bring on board to help to have a North-South dialogue, and look at, for example, another sector where the North can help the South. In my part of the world, there is a lot of tuna fishing. We can ensure, for example, sustainable tuna fishing. And this can be brought all the way up to the tables in the north in the United States, where you are, for example, where with a QR code, they can actually be able to retrace back. So we need the technology, we need the know-how, the training, we need the human power. And this is how, when I talk about the North-South dialogue, we can encourage this kind of discussion and move ahead. Sorry, the second question was, quickly remind me the second question.
Nikunj, can you unmute yourself again and ask the second question, please?
So I basically can't unmute because of security settings. But my second question was, you mentioned about how we are at the tipping point in today's
Okay,
world.
yes, yeah.
And
yeah. Yeah, I get it. You know, we always say that we have to rely on the leaders to make a difference. I think at the level of each one of us, we will be able to make a difference nationally. We know that all actions are local, but the impact has to be global. But having said this, there are certain things that actions at local level will not make that much of a difference. It can make a difference, I'll tell you, in what particular sector. If you look at the textile sector, which is the second biggest polluting sector in the world, the textile manufacturing. So if we adopt, for example, at individual level or at country level, the 3 R's, which is reduce, reuse, and recycle. And this is anathema, I know, to many parts of the world, because this is simply, not part of the narrative. But I think this is where individually we can make a difference and help, for example, retool the textile industry so that there is less impact in terms of the pollution of our waterways, for example. But still, we need the leadership at the global level to tackle global problems like climate change. I mean, air quality, for example, in India has to be tackled by your government. And it has to be tackled by, regional players as well, to ensure that whenever the pollution is spreading, they do something about it. So this is, I think, collectively, we can do things, but at the end of the day, you come back to the actions that we can each do, but we still need the global collective action to make a bigger difference at the international forum.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We have a question from, maybe we can take 2 questions together, just in the interest of time. So I'd invite Tamari, who's another GPOTS alum, and Marie, who is a current GPOTS fellow. So Tamari and Marie, over to you.
Hello, good day, Your Excellency. Now, we have mentioned about countries not signing the treaties or people relocating because of the climate change. And I would like to know, do you agree that climate change is likely to produce a massive hazard to peace and security in future? Or because it's mostly dependent on leaders. Also, relocation creates conflict between ethnicities and some cultures. So what are your thoughts on that?
Climate change, the impact of climate change is already happening. In fact, the war in Syria started because of the impacts of a changing climate. Crops are failing, people were moving from the rural areas to the urban areas. And there has been attribution to this. We know at the end of the day, we know that refugee crisis will increase. And I think it is said, I think some institutions are even projecting that 20% of the world, of the global population will be moving by 2050. Now, just think 20% by 2050, we're talking about 9 billion people. So you can imagine the impact that this will have on any country. Now, nothing can compete with an empty stomach. Nothing. So crops are failing. Families are losing families are losing sometimes the cattle that they depend on, and all this because of water cycles which have been disrupted, crops which are failing, and people will inevitably move. Now, people move, but there are barriers, and these barriers are man-made. And if you look at Africa 200, 300 years ago, before the arrival of the colonial powers, there were no barriers. And we know that the African continent we know now has been made after the Berlin Conference in the 1895. So, I mean, we're not going to go that route, but I'm saying is that people will move. Climate change will impact civilization, has impacted civilization for a long, long time, but it's going to happen more and more. And now that we have the power of media, we will see it, we will live it. And of course, it's causing increased changes in the political dynamics. We have seen populism rising everywhere in many parts of the world because of this migration crisis. But at the end of the day, how do we encourage people to stay back to their countries when we know that all we have to do is keep on investing, keep on creating the ecosystem where the young people, for example, will find opportunities, will be able to stay there and work. But with this, you need resources. And it comes back again to the dollar. How much money do we have?
Yeah, absolutely. And very quickly, Marie and Jonathan.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for such an insightful talk. A few chords touched which are a little painful, but yes, very relevant. So I have three questions. My first question is, how do you define or interpret the term green? Because today when we see how green is being defined, green is not independent of mining, fortunately or unfortunately. My second question in that same alignment is, Mauritius being dependent on tourism. So what specifically Mauritius as a nation does to preserve the biodiversity heritage that it has? And if you could please throw some light on the action plan that Mauritius has introduced until 2025 to totally stop invasive species coming in. So how have you incentivized that practice? So these are the three questions. Thank you very much.
If you were to ask my definition of what green is to me using resources which are not fossil, because fossil is limited, resources which are infinite and yet causes hardly any impact to the environment. And if you want to actually put it down to an example, for example, solar energy to me would be renewable, would be green. Wind energy will be, wave energy will also be green because it is not impacting, it's not using the finite resources that fossil fuel, for example, and the minerals actually bring on board. When it comes to a country like Mauritius, how do we, for example, limit invasive species? Again, it's a challenge. It's a challenge at many levels because while we have been good in the past, we have a unique biodiversity. Unfortunately, as we speak, we only have 1% of the forest covers. So the human impact has been huge in terms of what we have done in terms of damage to our forests, for example. But having said this, we have some good stories to share to the world. While we are recognized across the world for having housed at some point the dodo, which is now the symbol of extinction, we also now have the kestrel. And as a small country, a very, very small country lost in the middle of the Indian Ocean, we have contributed over 5% of the safeguard of the global fauna in terms of birds. So we have shown the good practices are there. We are challenged because invasive species, invasive species sometimes is beyond our control. When I talk about invasive species, there's of course the terrestrial species, there's of course the marine species. Now, if we are going to tackle the marine species, we're going to have to handle the marine industry. And there we have a behemoth in front of us. And here, I'll just take one example. For example, ballast water. All the ships which go in and the water gets exchanged, there is no regulation there to control the ballast water. So whatever is moving around, it's happening in all the waters, and that's a challenge. We have tried to bring some regulation in terms of plants and seeds, which actually come through our territory through the airlines. In fact, you hear that all the time. So we try to control this, and we are not allowed to import, for example, species of the Gramineae family, which are of the weed family, for example, because it's a challenge to the sugar industry here. So these are some of the measures we can, but at the end of the day, we're still dependent on the region. I'll just give you an example of how we handle one. This is where, again, regional organization and regional, the framework, the legal framework around the region matters. We know that there is the rosewood, for example, in Madagascar. The rosewood in Madagascar is threatened. It's a species which Madagascar is really at a loss to control. And it's in their regulation that this species is protected. Now, just imagine if there has been, and there has been a case in the past where the wood has been harvested illegally, it goes through our jurisdiction. Now, if somebody actually stops that shipping, we can't do anything about it because the rosewood is not in our CITES list. So how do we control? This is where regional organization, when they tackle species like this, we need to have cohesion, we need to have coherence when we handle species. That's why the CITES list has to be upgraded all the time. And at some point we used to have only orchids, but now we need to add more and more species. But for this to happen, we have politicians must speak to scientists. And again, scientists must learn to speak to politicians. This is the thing here, I'll make my mea culpa, we are weak. Because we speak to ourselves, we don't communicate enough to the outer community, we don't speak to policymakers, and this is where the weakness lies. So we have to increase the dialogue, and I think this is where the organization has a key role to play, is how to engage with these people to change the narrative in terms of addressing the policies. So regional approach, for example, I'm just giving one example of illegal harvesting of rosewood, which goes to some of the big countries, and also regulation downstream. Those countries which are exploiting that wood must also ask the question, the traceability of that, where has it come from? Has it come from a region where it is threatened with extinction? I mean, these are things we need to ask ourselves. In terms of consumers, we have a right to know. So at the level of the consumer, we have a huge power to be able to drive the change. We can be the change we want to see in this world. Mm-hmm. And I'm quoting again the great Mahatma, but it's true what he said. And so we need to be asking questions. As consumers, we need to be asking questions as to who, where these products are being harvested, be it at the level of the ocean, be it at the level of the earth, of the various habitats. So we have a big, we can be game changers, provided we start asking the question, provided we are empowered, provided we know we have the data. And of course, this comes also with strong institutions. And this is again where we need to ensure that institutions keep staying, keep growing, keep being reinforced and reinvigorated, because the institution of politics come and go, but institutions stay.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. We have about 14 minutes and so many questions coming in. So let me just bring in Jonathan, then Ashutosh, and then Arundhati.
Hi, Your Excellency. So a quick question. Could you talk a little bit more about your concept of regionalism and why do you keep bringing it up? And do you think more countries and nation states are going to be focused more on regionalism versus cooperating with larger developing nations?
One doesn't exclude the other. We are operating at the end of the day in a global arena, and where, goods and services are moving around all the time. When I talk about regional blocks, I mean, we have some major regional blocks. You have NAFTA in the United States. You have the ASEAN in Asia. You have seen also the African Union now, which has enacted the AFCFTA. And you have the European Union, which of course remains a very big, integration of many European countries, where the migration, the movement of goods and services, I think exceed 60%, where Africa is still the paltry 20%. And I think the ASEAN, the bloc, represents a very, very good bloc in as much as it shows the power of diversity. There is no one size fits all. If you have the various countries which make up the ASEAN, I mean, some of them are mavericks, but they have made it work. And they have been also a very good instrument for peace. And they have driven peace in a region where it was impossible to even think of it a few years ago. And we have seen that when peace was possible, prosperity ensured. And so prosperity, in fact, we saw the emerge, of course, of the Asian tigers, and we have seen how prosperity has increased in countries like Vietnam, for example, that have seen tremendous growth within the ASEAN framework. So this is what we need to do, but of course, there's no stopping ASEAN from discussing with the EU or discussing with NAFTA or Mercosur and all these regions. So we need the blocks because it's close proximity. There can be so much exchanges, but there is no one size fits all. We have to increase the global dialogue to ensure a peaceful world, but more importantly, we have to acknowledge that we are increasingly going towards a more diverse, a more multipolar world, where the power play will be different to what it was when the United Nations was set up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. My question is that what are your views on some upcoming technologies like solar radiation management? There are ethical concerns and unintended consequences associated with these technologies, but these are also inexpensive. Can countries like Mauritius or small developing nations take unilateral action to implement these technologies if we cross the tipping point and the sea level rises and there is a lot of drowning and people are not able to relocate properly?
In terms of the technology, I think already we have made the pledge rather in Paris to go up to 35% renewable. And we have an interesting mix when we look at the energy mix in Mauritius. Because at some point we used to be a big producer of sugar. And we actually use the bagasse actually to generate our energy. So for about 4 to 5 months, we depended on a mix of bagasse. Of course, then you can say it's a green energy because it's biomass. And we used to have also power, hydroelectric power, but now with the vagaries of climate change, this of course is not there so much. We can't rely on too much. We are trying also a mix of wind, but I think the solar one, I think to me has more potential. And I think even India launched in 2015 in Paris, the Global Energy Alliance, and pushing for the greener energies, solar, and with the way we get energy, solar energy, 12 to 13 hours per day. I don't see why we can't do that. In fact, even now, a country like Morocco is capitalizing this for the Sahara and pushing for solar energy. So I think we have to get our heads around this problem that no economy can progress without, of course, access to energy, a stable, of course, of energy. So this should be our main focus, is to ensure that the energy supply is there, it's available. And unfortunately, my continent, the African continent, has always been described as being the dark continent, but there are so many initiatives which are now happening with social entrepreneur, young people pushing for elaboration of various forms of energy mix so that energy is available to one and all. But having said this, we also have to see that there's a question I saw in the box, the rare earth metal. Yes, how do we make that sustainable? Because at the end of the day, we are still digging. Now, how do we recycle at the end of the day? This is again work in progress. How do we store the energy which has been generated from the sun? Where are the battery power? All these issues need to be discussed, because one thing that we know for sure is that emission is driving climate change. And one thing we have to do immediately is to see how we can reduce emission.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And we have Arundhati, who's also a GPAD's fellow. So Arundhati, over to you.
Thanks, Arpit. Hi, Your Majesty. Hi, Your Excellency. I'm sorry. It's a pleasure reconnecting with you. We had a chance to meet during Shape Africa in Port Louis back in 2016. My question to you is that you spoke about the role of Africa and its importance in the future. So do you think, like, we have so many African leaders in the multilateral agencies now, IMF, WHO, WTO. Do you see any change, or do you think that it has like potential to really change the narratives and increase its role and help in its development?
Well, having players in all this is important. At least there is representation, as you have rightly said. We have now Ngozi at the WTO, and just like we have many Indian nationals who are operating out in the Silicon Valley, and we are seeing many very talented Indian across the world. I think representation for 1.2 billion people out in India, it matters to see that their people are doing so well outside. They become the role model for the young people to actually aspire to a higher position. Same thing goes for Africa. If we have more and more people represented, the talent is recognized, it matters to the young people who are emerging out in Africa. But having said this, are they able to make the difference at that level? I mean, this is again another layer of discussion which take place because the power play is maybe beyond them. So we're trying to get there, but as I've said before, the difference will come at regional level when these countries unite and decide to collaborate and cooperate more and more, do away with less kind of warlike attitude, which we have seen in terms of stopping this country, stopping that country. We're not there. We shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be in that space. We should use all our resources to tackle the major challenges which are facing us. And one of the major challenges we have is climate change. So we have to put, and also one main challenge we also have to think about increasingly is inequity and inequality. And inequality we have seen over the past years, over the past months rather, how the gap between the have and the have-not have increased, the chasm. And I'll have to again to go back to United States. It was branded as the country where you can live your dream. If you're good, you can have the American dream. But ask yourself the question now, is the American dream still valid? Or are you now going to be defined by the resources of your parents for you to have access to college education? Because we know that education is the enabler. Now, is an average American whose parent doesn't have the resources, if he or she is talented, is he or she going to have the American dream? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. But the same thing will happen even in places like India, because you are an emerging country, places like China and all these. But I think where we have to see to it that inequality does not define us. And unfortunately, even a country like India, which is doing so well internationally, you still have millions of kids going to sleep at night without food in the stomach. So this is the thing that this should sit in our conscience. We shouldn't allow this to happen. And how do we do it? Again, it depends on policies that governments take. And policies are also defined, but the other level of power play is there. One thing as well, I will also say, we see now the guardrail of, I just will use one example, the guardrail of communication, of information now is big tech. And we have seen how they have avoided payment of tax until recently when the G20 decided to impose 15% for tax. So these institutions, they have to play the rule of the game. They have to learn to pay the taxes. And the biggest corporate social responsibility any corporation can do is to pay the taxes. That's the biggest CSR.
Absolutely. We still have 4 minutes left, so I'll bring in Saeed and then Sunil if he's still around. So Saeed, over to you.
Wonderful presentation, Your Excellency. I'm so quite impressed. My name is Saeed. I'm from Nigeria, and I'm really, really, really feeling happy now. Though I have a question. And my question has to do with citizen participation. How have you been able to enhance citizen participation in Mauritius such a way that you're able to strengthen the biodiversity complexity, resolve some of the biodiversity complexity in the country? And also, what do you think we could do with citizen observatory centers as a means to incentivize the ways with which citizens can prioritize nature-based solutions to technological solutions? Since in Africa, we don't have much money, so we need nature-based solutions. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Well, you are from the biggest economy in Africa right now. You are number one, Nigeria. I think here I'll put my hat of the university academic. I think we have to communicate, keep on communicating, and engage with young people. I think this is where, again, there we are weak in Africa because the chasm between the leaders in terms of the age gap is so wide, because some leaders, we know they are very, very elderly, and they may not be in touch with the young people. And Africa, the median age is around 16 to 18 in some countries, right? So this is, again, we have to communicate, we have to engage, and we also have to put at the disposal the resources. And I call again on the corporates in Africa to be that corporate person that gave Mark Zuckerberg the $100,000, for example, to go to Palo Alto and register Facebook. So if we have more of such philanthropists in Africa, we should be able to empower more young people, because there is no dearth of talent. There is no dearth of talent on this beautiful continent of ours, But we have the resources, but we need the leadership. And we need the willpower from one and all. And we can't just put it squarely at the level of the leaders, because at many other levels, we should be able to make a difference, and we can make a difference. But we need the leadership at various levels. We need to communicate, we need to empower, and we need to make them have access to tools, technology, you name it, energy. We have just been discussing. So that's really the way forward. Again, more access and more sharing and more giving.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And we have Sunil. That'll probably be the last question. If we just have 30 seconds left, we'll probably get Hezbon as well. But Sunil, over.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Arpit. Thank you very much. I'm Sunil Muralidhar Shastri. I'm an independent consultant, expert, and speaker in ocean and environmental governance, based normally in the UK. You may recall, Your Excellency, that we met in July 2013 when I led the National Ocean Dialogue.
Yes.
And I coined a phrase there, Republic of Mauritius, a small island state, a large ocean economy. They printed some t-shirts, they gave me one too. Anyway, but coming back to your point about Partha Dasgupta, and he has, as you probably know, that the UK government has published the Dasgupta report, which is the economics of biodiversity. And as you rightly pointed out, the biodiversity is one of the biggest challenges facing the planet. But going back to Partha Dasgupta again, his seminal work, his original work when he was young, was control of resources. And that's what we want, to grab our resources and control them. And that brings me to the small island countries. And although you have great spokesmen nowadays in the form of Mr. Thompson of Fiji, but what more, and you mentioned that the groups are going to be more important, ASEAN, etc. So what more can groups like SIDS or AOSIS do to make themselves more empowered? What is it that they can now do? Because there are the big powers, and the small island states are big powers because they're large ocean economies. So how can this, how can this work? Thank you.
Thank you. You know that a group of over 30 at the level of the United Nations is very important. So it's a group that can make or break a vote. Or abstention or whatever, the dynamic of the United Nations. But I think beyond that, beyond the politics, I think the SIDS, they have a huge opportunity to share good practices. And I've just explained one example of Seychelles, for example. They have, of course, they were in the when we're discussing the ocean economy in 2013, I think they were represented. So there are so many good practices which are happening. And I think we as a group, we can share so many of these, share the practices we have, because we have more in common with them than we would have with larger countries because of the common challenges that we all face. So I think this is already something that we have to do. Controlling of better control, as you say, of our resources. This is a challenge because we don't have the resources. I mean, just think of the ocean space in Mauritius, 2.2 million square kilometer. Exactly. Yeah. So this is again where we need partnership. And we need partnership to be able to engage together. But, at the end of the day, when it comes to partnership, it also means, of course, access to resources. And this is again where there is weaknesses because we don't have the strong institution to be able to control the discussion. And so again, we need to collaborate and cooperate. And the only way to do this is operating through blocks. So be it AOSIS, be it SIDS, be it at the level of Africa, SADC, COMESA, all these blocks. This is the only way that we will be able to make a difference, make headway when we actually sit down together, look at the resources and decide on the way forward. But sharing and partnering, of course, will be the way forward.
And talking of biodiversity, how can one forget the dodo bird? Now extinct dodo.
Well, we have good stories. As I'm saying to the tourist people here, please don't stop using dodo. Let's use the kestrel because it's a success story. Absolutely. And it's still alive.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are already over time. So sorry, Hezbon and a couple of our other friends who've been messaging me. This was the last question for the day. But I think partnering and sharing is the way forward, is the lesson that we can leave with. Thank you, Your Excellency, for being so candid and being so detailed with and open with your responses, and for sparing the time. I think this is something that we value a lot in our fellowship. It has been an absolute privilege and a pleasure to have you over here. I would now invite Jonathan to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you,
Oh,
Arpit.
well, Arpit, I mean, you pretty much did it, but thank you. Your Excellency, so thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Someone of your stature and experience, your insights are definitely invaluable. Some of your words on North-South cooperation, human capital, a greener economy, and reforming the international geopolitical space for developing countries are very insightful. And on behalf of GPODs, on behalf of the cohort, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to having you again in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.